Welcome to the history section.
Today we're beginning a targeted analysis centered on the ancient faith of Shinto.
Right, and specifically we're looking at its really singular role within Japan.
Exactly. How it functions as this deeply rooted patriotic cult and its foundational connection to the national identity.
And to start, we really have to establish just how rare this phenomenon is.
It's incredibly rare. The historical analysis is very clear on this. For a civilized nation to have a religion that is intrinsically its own.
Something that wasn't imported.
Precisely. A faith connected directly to what's called the springs of national life. That's not the norm.
No, not at all. For most great nations throughout history, the main religious framework has been an import.
Almost without exception, yes. You think of Christianity spreading through Europe or Buddhism across Asia. They were external systems adapted by new cultures.
So if we're looking for a counterexample, a place where faith and national consciousness are basically indistinguishable.
Then the primary historical exception that's always provided is the ancient Hebrews.
And that identification was just so profound. I mean, in Hebrew literature, it's genuinely hard to separate a theological discussion of God from a talk about the Commonwealth.
Or to tell if the writer is talking about a spiritual heaven or the actual city of Jerusalem.
Right, and that blend, that fusion of religious commitment and national patriotism, it created this fierce, patient loyalty.
A loyalty that few other societies have really replicated. And it's this identification that's credited with allowing them to maintain their integrity as a people.
Critically, even when they were scattered and didn't have a national home.
That's the key. The religious structure, woven so tightly with their concept of peoplehood, it effectively carried the national identity in the absence of a political empire.
The faith became the memory.
In a sense, yes, the carrier of political and cultural memory.
So if the Hebrew tradition is the first major exception, then Shinto is positioned as the second, the other preeminently patriotic cult.
And its persistence is remarkable. Through all the internal challenges, the external pressures, the efforts by foreign propagandists.
It's remained.
It has. Not just as the real religion of the land, but as the loyal, emotional heart that unifies the entire nation.
The analysis is very direct about this. It calls Shinto the state religion.
It is. It functions as the central emotional core for every subject of the nation. Now, of course, other faiths exist. Buddhist, Confucian, later Christian traditions.
That they're seen as guests.
Exactly. Guests in the spiritual landscape. The underlying foundational loyalty of every subject is tied to the national faith. It isn't just a religion, it's the religion of the state.
So we have these two models, the Hebrew and the Shinto traditions, both with this unbreakable link between faith and patriotism.
But their external fates, as history shows us, have gone in completely different directions.
An almost inverse contrast, really.
It is. The Hebrew influence, despite its political empire vanishing for millennia, it came to dominate the chief civilizations of the world through its religious legacy.
Shaping the moral and theological structures of the West and the Middle East.
Meanwhile, Shinto, this unique, purely national religion of Japan, is barely known by name outside of specialist circles.
And yet, the nation it unifies
has, in the context of this history, rapidly ascended to become one of the great world powers.
And that political ascent, coupled with this spiritual insularity, is where we can explore the paradox of Shinto's vitality.
Yes, and it presents a really stark contrast to Western experiences with institutional religion.
How so?
Well, in many Western civilizations, religious institutions often carry on with great outward vigor. Enormous cathedrals, large congregations, complex structures.
But there's a sense that the spirit has gone out of them.
A widespread acknowledgement of it. They're often seen as these well-maintained but rigid shells of their former spiritual power, disconnected from people's daily emotional lives.
And Shinto is the inverse of that, a really perplexing phenomenon.
It is. You have a situation with deserted shrines, very little outward ceremony, and yet its essence remains the most vitally effective, cohesive force in the nation's life.
The strength is completely separate from the public ritual or the buildings.
It resides purely in the internal spirit of the people. And this paradox gets even deeper when you look at the intellectual side of it.
Meaning how the Japanese themselves view the theology.
Precisely. The research confirms that its theological traditions, the creation myths, the divine descent of the emperors, are openly and often hopelessly discredited by modern educated people.
And the worship itself.
Where it still persists, it's often acknowledged to be mere ceremonialism, a duty you perform for tradition's sake, not out of fervent belief. Intellectually, it's a formalism.
So that's the central question. How does a faith whose doctrines are dismissed and whose rituals are seen as empty, how does that remain the source of unswerving national loyalty?
The power must be coming from somewhere else. It has to transcend the discredited tradition or the empty ritual. We have to define this secret living force.
And the analysis does offer a definition.
It does, and a very clear one. The power of Shinto today isn't about theology. It signifies character in a higher sense.
Things like courage, courtesy, honor.
And above all else, absolute, unquestioning loyalty. It has, in a way, moved beyond a conventional Western understanding of faith.
So it's undergone a kind of transformation. It's not functioning as a system to explain the cosmos anymore.
It's functioning as a highly effective ethical and moral driver. That is the fundamental transmutation.
Its spirit isn't defined by dogma.
No, but by emotional and hereditary impulse. It's the spirit of absolute filial piety, the pure zest of duty, and the readiness to surrender one's life for a principle.
For the nation.
For the nation, without pausing to consider the wherefore, the logical or theological consequences of that action.
It's religion becoming something else, becoming a moral instinct.
Transmuted into ethical instinct, yes, passed down through generations. It's become identified as the entire emotional life of the race, the soul of Japan.
And that internalized patriotic feeling is what persists, even when the formal religious structure is, for all intents and purposes, abandoned.
To put it simply, Shinto survives, not because of its beliefs or temples, but because it successfully fused national identity with absolute moral duty. It created an emotional engine for loyalty that is entirely self-sustaining.
Which brings us to the factors that fostered this specific patriotic fervor. Before we get to the positive contents of the faith, we have to look at the scaffolding, the historical and environmental context.
Right, and starting with Japan's physical and historical isolation.
The nation's long experience of seclusion, living within itself.
That's a major formative contributor. Isolation breeds homogeneity. It prevents that slow dilution of customs and values you see in nations with constant migration and cultural mixing. It lets a single national character solidify.
And then there's the environment itself, the land.
A critical factor. The land is described as so strangely and profoundly beautiful that the early worship of nature, a key feature of Shinto, developed very organically into this overwhelming, passionate pride of country.
The sacredness of the place became the foundation for the sacredness of the nation.
Exactly. But what's truly singular about Shinto's structure is its genius for unity, which stands out precisely because of what it lacks.
It lacks the usual elements that breed religious conflict.
And that's why, in Western contexts, it's often denied the name of a religion at all. The argument is that if a faith lacks the structure to define precise boundaries, there's nothing substantial to quarrel over.
We should probably detail some of those specific absences.
We should, because they're crucial. First and foremost, Shinto has no rigid, articulated system of dogmas.
No fixed theological principles, which means there's no intellectual requirement that excludes other ideas. That allows for a huge amount of flexibility.
And it dramatically reduces the potential for schism. Similarly, there's no semblance of a creed.
No declaration to define who's in and who's out.
Your adherence is measured by loyalty to the state, not by reciting a text. Which brings us to the next point. It lacks an infallible book.
Which is a monumental difference. Sacred texts are so often the source of literalist conflict, sectarian splits.
Arguments over interpretation, translation. Shinto's reliance on custom and ethical instinct over scripture avoids all of that.
We should also note the absence of idols.
Yes, for a primitive faith, the lack of physical representations prevents countless disputes over iconography or the sanctity of specific objects. The focus stays on the natural entity or the ancestors being revered.
And there's no separate, centralized priesthood, no clerical caste.
Right, and a powerful clerical body often leads to power struggles, claims of spiritual monopoly, accumulation of wealth, all things Shinto largely avoids by making the spiritual duty inherent to the individual and the family.
Then on the metaphysical side, the omissions are just as striking. There's no systematic, universal moral code.
And, maybe most importantly for control, no promise of a specific heaven.
Which removes the incentive to pursue an afterlife reward over your absolute duty to the state on earth.
Your reward is the glory of the empire, not personal salvation. And conversely, there's no threat of hell.
No eternal damnation.
Which eliminates the ultimate tool of control. Fear. Spiritual coercion. If you take away the existential threats, You have to find a more immediate internal source of motivation.
The sociological result of all these absences is profound. The history is clear that religious wars have been practically unknown in the empire's history.
Which is an almost unbelievable achievement for any large nation. And this structure also dictated the nation's attitude toward outside beliefs.
Instead of hostility, the default was hospitality.
A sympathetic and respectful hospitality, yes, as long as those other faiths didn't challenge the fundamental loyalty to the state.
The treatment of early Christian missionaries illustrates this perfectly.
It does. Initially, they were met with welcoming courtesy. Persecution only ignited when suspicion arose, and it was a political suspicion, not theological.
The fear that the spread of these new tenets might threaten the integrity of the nation itself.
The conflict was purely patriotic. The sword was drawn when the state was threatened, not when a doctrine was challenged. The Japanese military, so quick to act against a threat to the state, has never been drawn against someone simply for their religious opinions.
We need to go back to that specific absence of a moral code, because the native explanation for it is, well, it's very telling.
It's telling, and it's entirely circular. It's rooted in a kind of national exceptionalism.
The argument being that a specific ethical framework isn't needed.
Exactly. The lack of one is accounted for on the grounds that the innate perfection of Japanese humanity, just by being loyal subjects of the Son of Heaven, the Mikado, makes any other external moral guidance unnecessary.
So loyalty to the leader becomes the only virtue required.
It becomes the all-comprehensive duty. The Mikado is seen as the supreme entity, both ethically and politically. Therefore, loyalty to him is the only moral compass needed.
And the implication is that an external code, like a set of divine commandments, is only for people who don't acknowledge the Mikado's authority.
Yes. For a Japanese subject, morality is patriotism. And this framework, fostered by what Shinto lacks, ensures that internal peace, which then allows the powerful positive elements of the faith to flourish.
So if the absences unify the country by preventing conflict, now we can turn to the positive pillars, the elements that actively stimulated that patriotic spirit.
And while there's been speculation on esoteric practices, all historical investigators agree on the two main features: nature worship and reverence for the dead.
Let's start with nature worship. This is much more than just appreciating a nice landscape.
Far more. The research asserts that nothing else could better inspire and strengthen that love and loyalty, especially in a people so susceptible to beauty, given their unique geography.
The fact that Japan is a group of islands is key.
It's critical. The analysis draws parallels to places like Switzerland or England. That physical isolation intrinsically inspires patriotic affection, creates a natural sense of us and ours.
Beyond that, the climate and topography themselves almost demand reverence.
They do. The islands stretch through these highly favored latitudes, giving them an incredible environmental diversity. The land ranges from almost continental in scale down to these small, perfect visions of romantic beauty.
And the land's formation is described as violent and dramatic.
Shaped first by earthquakes and volcanoes into these wildest and weirdest forms, and then clothed in this luxuriant green by moisture-laden winds. It creates an environment of intense, perpetual beauty.
So for a race with a keen susceptibility to that beauty, nature worship almost inevitably develops into an intense patriotism.
The reverence for the physical land becomes inseparable from reverence for the political entity. The soil itself is sacred.
And this connection finds its most striking physical manifestation in the torii, the sacred gateway.
Right, the architectural representation of this whole philosophy. Its construction is so elegantly simple and so constant, whether it's made of wood or stone or metal.
2 columns, slightly inclined, supporting 2 crossbeams.
And it illustrates that Japanese capacity to produce the best aesthetic and spiritual effects with the simplest means.
Its function is to mark the path to hallowed ground. But crucially, unlike a church gate or something similar, a torii doesn't necessarily mean a temple is nearby.
Its ubiquity underscores that point. You find them everywhere, at the start of a mountain path, deep in a forest, at the edge of a rice field, on a lake bank.
Its presence signals sacred space. But that sacredness is defined by nature, not by organized religion.
Right. And if you follow the path under the torii, it often reveals the true, non-dogmatic nature of the faith. You might find a temple, but more often you find a simple shrine.
A shrine with, as the analysis emphasizes, often nothing inside. No idol, no relic.
Because the reason for the shrine's placement is nearby. It's situated next to a striking natural feature, a twisted pine tree, a grove of ancient trees, a fantastically shaped rock.
The shrine is there to consecrate the beauty of the place itself.
Exactly. And sometimes the path ends with no shrine at all. It just leads to a high place, a viewpoint, where the magnificent panorama of the country is spread out before you.
History tells us that wherever a subject can stand and behold the land of their birth.
That spot is consecrated as the temple of their faith. The ultimate object of worship is the nation's topography.
But this deep aestheticism, it presented a potential danger, didn't it?
It did. If Shinto were only this aesthetic love of country, the nation might have faced a cultural softening, a decline.
The research brings up a comparison here to ancient Greece.
It does. It notes many parallels in the intense love of beauty and nature. But the analysis, and we should note it uses language of its time, argues that Greece sank into the depths of effeminacy and degeneration from following only aesthetic nature worship.
The point being that beauty alone, without a corresponding ethical framework, can lead to collapse.
That's the structural point being made. And Japan avoided this because Shinto possessed a second crucial virile element.
Something that provided a stimulus to duty and fashioned a sturdy character.
Yes, something that kept the patriotic fires alive and active. And that element is the second positive pillar: reverence for the dead, ancestor worship.
And this practice reached a higher, more pervasive stage of development in Japan than anywhere else.
When you join that with the nature worship of such a beautiful land, that's considered the sufficient explanation for the intensity and stability of the national spirit.
And the contrast with Greece is maintained here.
Very starkly. Greece, once a place of sublime heroism, faded. Japan, in contrast, emerged from centuries of intentional peace and seclusion.
Periods that often breed weakness.
Right. But it emerged strong and cohesive, with a devotion to country as fervent as ever.
And the secret to that sustained energy is this reverence.
It's the reverence paid not just to the dead, but also to the living as they grow old. The sentiment and practice of filial piety and the instinct of unquestioning obedience that it fosters that explains this miracle of human energy.
Let's look at the practical effect of this. The conflict with China at the time the sources were written is used as a specific illustration.
It's a perfect example of its power. The support for the military during that war was characterized by absolute, unwavering unity.
And there's a fascinating psychological mechanism at play here.
There is. Every soldier in the field was motivated not just by the knowledge that 40 million people were behind him, with no dissent,
but also by this consciousness of a vaster but viewless host with them on the battlefield.
This viewless resource is central. It's not just an abstract tradition. The belief is that the very figures from the nation's history, the heroes, the ancestors, are themselves present actively in the fray, urging their descendants on.
The psychological weight of that must be immense.
It is. And this host is comprehensive and deeply personal. It includes the divine lineage of the emperors, the ancient princes, the great chieftains, all the heroes from the country's annals.
But also, crucially, the dead of one's own household, your immediate ancestors.
Yes. They are now considered divine witnesses to the soldier's valor. You're fighting under the direct, unblinking gaze of your entire lineage and the whole history of your race.
And this active reverence for the dead, which extends to absolute deference to elders in daily life, is the source of that national discipline of obedience.
The direct genesis of it. This culture has systematically molded the nation into a vast family of law-loving and law-abiding people, and that virtue of implicit obedience when transferred from the family to the state.
It made the army a magnificent and efficient machine.
The youth fighting Japan's battles had centuries of cultural training in implicit, unquestioning obedience to the elders of the household. It generated the iron soldier and the loyal patriot.
Individuals whose impulse to duty was entirely instinctive.
It required minimal internal debate. So any potential adversary assessing the empire's strength has to account for this. The viewless energies generated by the national faith are argued to be vastly more important than the physical power of the population alone.
It's a source of psychological strength that arguably other nations can't replicate.
So when we synthesize these two elements, nature worship and ancestor worship, we get the full picture of this national unity. The foundation is an intense, aesthetic love of a land that is worthy of that love.
And that spiritual foundation is then strengthened by centuries of training in filial piety,
creating a deathless loyalty to both the living and the dead. So Shinto, while lacking the conventional features of a religion, possesses the essentials of a true faith through its immense power to create this patriotic sentiment and demand faithfulness.
This unique combination of aesthetic love and absolute moral duty has molded the life of Japan into a unity that, the research suggests no other nation has ever approached.
The people act with but one thought and one desire, the glory and honor of the empire.
The final definition, then, is that its reality lives not in books or rites or commandments.
But in the national heart, it is the highest emotional religious expression of that heart, a mighty spiritual force beneath the surface mythology, representing the very soul of the race, operating purely through instinct.
A soul where beauty, art, heroism, loyalty, and faith have all become inherent, unconscious.
And instinctive. That fusion of aesthetic appreciation and absolute patriotic duty, forged over centuries, is the true, enduring essence of Shinto.
So to understand its historical power, one has to look past the formalism in theology and recognize that mysterious soul of the race.
Recognizing that the nation's strength is embedded in that profound, unified feeling. Today, we're examining a really fascinating concept, Japan, as a sort of unconquered island realm.
And this is a twofold idea, isn't it? It details this long, enduring immunity from both military and religious foreign domination over millennia.
Exactly. The focus of the research is really on the nature of national faith, of loyalty as a primary defense mechanism, a non-physical one.
So where do we start?
Well, the discussion really centers on two extraordinary claims in the historical accounts. The first is the sheer antiquity of the imperial dynasty.
The one described as unbroken from ages eternal?
Precisely. It's the world's longest continuous monarchy. And the second claim is the historical fact that for, about 2,500 years, no foreign military invader has ever successfully occupied the realm.
And that physical immunity is mirrored by something else.
It is. It's mirrored by a unique and you could say equally tenacious cultural immunity, especially when it comes to religion.
Okay, so let's begin with the physical reality, with the geography.
Japan is, hugely indebted for its unique history to what the accounts call the rampart of the ocean waves.
Its position in the Pacific, that isolation just makes a concerted invasion effort incredibly difficult.
Well nigh impossible is the phrase used. And when you think about the logistics involved, you can see why. It's not just a footnote. It's foundational to this whole narrative.
The research draws a comparison, doesn't it? It refers to Japan as the England of the Pacific.
It does, and it's a useful analogy. Both nations get immense benefits from being islands, those inherent defensive advantages.
But there's a key difference.
A huge difference.
Yeah.
Japan's defense is fundamentally enhanced by the seas, separating it from the mainland being so much wider than the English Channel.
Right.
That distance just completely changes the math for any power thinking about an amphibious assault. It requires a level of naval power and supply chain resilience that, almost no one in history has ever had.
But it's not just about the water, is it? The defense mechanism isn't purely geographical?
No, not at all. History shows that the nation has a second and maybe even more formidable rampart. And this one is entirely psychological.
You mean national pride, that fervent patriotism.
An intensely localized and focused version of it. The research suggests this devotion is unparalleled, even more so than its Western counterpart, England, in its most isolationist periods. It's this mindset that turns the population into a constant defense force.
And this has some really profound implications for any potential conqueror.
Profound is the right word, almost existential. The historical accounts basically argued that to imagine a conquered Japan, you have to imagine the annihilation of an entire race of people.
Because few Japanese would be willing to survive the loss of their country's sovereignty.
Or would even care to survive it. It's not just loyalty in the way we might think of it. It's a fundamental weaving together of personal identity and national existence.
So how does that loyalty manifest itself? What would happen if an invader actually landed?
The consequence of even a temporary subjection to a foreign power, it would have been catastrophic for the invader. It would provoke this immediate and unconquerable spirit of revenge.
A kind of prolonged resistance.
Exactly. The entire land would transform into a vast militarized camp. The whole population would become a body of determined, iron soldiery ready for, not just one battle, but a long existential guerrilla war.
And we have evidence of this intense conviction. The research points to some extreme examples.
It does. Recorded instances of extreme self-sacrifice. For example, a Japanese person choosing to kill themselves as the ultimate way to draw public attention to a perceived national danger.
There's a specific record about the Russians, right?
Yes, a self-inflicted death because of conviction that the nation needed to be warned about what were seen as Russian encroachments on their national interests.
Now, from a modern perspective, that might seem like an isolated, fanatical act.
Of course. But the research frames it very differently. It sees it as a factor infecting the entire body of the people.
So it's a metric, a way of measuring the extreme conviction that defines this patriotism.
Exactly. It's a critical, if intangible, part of the national defense that any Western power thinking of an invasion would have to factor in. The cost of invasion goes way beyond just military logistics, when you know the population will mobilize instantly and see any compromise as extinction.
And the ultimate historical validation for this unconquered status comes from the Mongol invasion of 1281.
Under Kublai Khan, yes. This event isn't just a military failure for the Mongols, it's the absolute cornerstone of the national mythos about divine protection. It reinforces this whole belief in Japan's destined immunity.
And this was no small skirmish.
Not at all. It was the most concerted, large-scale invasion attempt in Japanese history before the modern era. The scale of it really confirms the gravity of the threat they overcame.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The historical accounts are meticulous. They detail an enormous Mongol force, a fleet of about 3,500 ships,
3,500.
and an estimated 140,000 soldiers and sailors. I mean, for the 13th century, that is a colossal number. This was meant to be the final piece of Kublai Khan's conquest of Asia.
And the Japanese defenders were just massively outnumbered.
They were, even with their preparations, like the stone wall along Hakata Bay. The invading force simply dwarfed them.
So what happened? How were they delivered from this?
After weeks of fighting that had kind of stalled on the coast, the deliverance came from a massive, completely unexpected weather event. A mighty typhoon.
It's a curious parallel with European history, isn't it? The Spanish Armada.
It's the exact same power of nature. It confirms that nature itself is often the supreme, decisive naval power. The typhoon just scattered and destroyed most of the fleet. Tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers drowned without the Japanese even having to engage in a final decisive battle.
But the Japanese narrative interprets this very differently. It's not just a lucky storm.
No, it's interpreted through a deeply religious lens. The account holds that the Shinto gods of Ise, responding to desperate national prayer and rituals, actually raised this tempest,
They called it the kamikaze.
the divine wind. And this religious interpretation of a natural disaster permanently reinforces what the accounts call the deathless faith in the sacredness of the soil kami no kuni and the eternal integrity of the empire.
It becomes a theological assurance.
A permanent one. The kamikaze incident suggests to the people that their protection is divinely guaranteed, not just by the ocean, but by this lofty sentiment of patriotism itself. The belief is that the nation is protected by forces beyond human capability.
So the failure of the Mongols was proof that divine will was aligned with their national loyalty.
Exactly. It proved the country was unconquerable by human design.
So despite this long history of immunity from physical attack, Japan has been subject to other kinds of invasions.
Yes, intense religious or ideological invasions. And this shifts our focus to the second dimension of this immunity. How is physical immunity different from susceptibility to outside ideas?
And there's a critical distinction to be made there.
A very critical one. The influence of these foreign faiths, Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, it was immense. It profoundly modified intellectual life, art, social conditions.
But none of them ever actually supplanted the ancient national faith, Shinto.
Not for a moment. They failed to achieve a fundamental, conquering transformation of the nation's religious core.
Which leads to this unconquerable thesis in the religious sphere. In other places, when an alien faith conquers, the old cults just disappear or become unrecognizable.
Right. And the research says that in Japan, almost the exact opposite happened. The quote is, "There was no genuine conversion there except that of the would-be converter."
The invading ideology was the one that was changed.
Fundamentally altered. Over time, these invading faiths became little more than adjuncts or supplements to the ancient and only living religion of the empire.
Which is Shinto. And how would you define the core of Shinto?
It's fundamentally about two intertwined principles. First, a passionate admiration of their beautiful land, and second, a devoted reverence for the dead who have made it famous. It's an expression of deep, localized attachment and continuity.
So a Japanese person could become a Buddhist or a Confucian, but they never stop being a Shintoist.
Never. Because Shinto isn't just a religion in the Western sense. It's synonymous with love of the native land and loyalty to the imperial line. To reject Shinto would be seen as an act of treachery.
And you can see this in practice, right? The syncretism.
You can. It's most evident in the architecture. Unlike in, say, Russia, where you might see a cross placed above a crescent to signify victory. In Japan, you find Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples standing right next to each other.
Sometimes with the same priest officiating in both.
Often. It shows a deliberate, harmonious merging of practices, not a supplanting of the native faith. The foreign ideology is absorbed and, you could say, domesticated.
Let's take the first major influx then, Confucianism.
It arrived between the 5th and 8th centuries. And history tells us it didn't come in a spirit of conquest or with any militant zeal.
It was seen more as a bearer of somewhat that could be welcomed for the nation's good.
Exactly. It was treated more like a structured philosophy, a form of learning, rather than a competing religion.
And it served a specific function. Shinto was a bit weak on providing a detailed code of morals for society.
It was. It provided the spiritual attachment, but not a systematic ethical code. Confucianism supplied that structure. It added an ethical sanction to the reverence for the aged and the dead that was already central to the native faith.
So it was a natural fit.
A very cordial one. And the result was that Confucianism gained this remarkable intellectual ascendancy, especially among scholars and the ruling class, for about 3 centuries. But it always existed in close friendship with Shinto.
Okay, what about the next force, Buddhism?
Buddhism arrived a bit earlier, in the 6th century, and it came with much more of a propaganda zeal than Confucianism.
But the Japanese reaction was similar.
In a way. In their characteristic pragmatism, they used Buddhism primarily to supply what they saw as deficiencies in Shinto worship, rather than accepting it as an overthrow of the existing order.
So it was about filling the gaps.
Precisely. Shinto didn't have a complex body of dogma. Its ritual was often described as bare, quite stark.
And Buddhism brought all of that.
It brought an elaborate dogmatic system, detailed cosmology, and it offered ornate services and aesthetic splendor. It gave a whole new impetus to the nation's aesthetic life, and particularly to its funeral rites.
The research also notes a factor related to what were then called racial theories.
Yes, and we need to be very clear about this. The 19th century source material we're drawing from operated within a now outdated academic framework.
Right.
It noted that Buddhism was adopted almost exclusively by what were then classified as Turanian races across Asia, which supported its reception in Japan. And it contrasted this with Christianity's success among what it called the Aryan family.
So this was their way of arguing for a kind of deterministic limit on religious conversion based on cultural lineage.
Yes, and it's important to contextualize that language as a product of its time. But despite all these favoring influences, the pragmatic need, the supposed racial congeniality Buddhism only gained its ascendancy through a systematic process of subsumption.
Anjisujaku.
Exactly. Essentially, the foreign faith was absorbed. Buddhism incorporated all the native Shinto gods, the kami, into its own pantheon. It identified them as local manifestations of various Buddhist deities.
It gave them new names, rebaptized their festivals.
It did. It offered the alien faith as just another richer form of what the nation already believed.
And this is really the critical point about Japan's cultural immunity.
It is. The hospitality shown to Buddhist missionaries was repaid not by a Japanese conversion to Buddhism, but by the propagandists basically surrendering their own religion to these assimilating influences.
The scholar Dr. Griffiths is quoted on this.
He is. He concludes that the thing that has suffered reversion is the exotic rather than the native plant. Japan experienced no fundamental change of heart. The Buddhist framework was adopted, but the Shinto core remained untouched.
And this is demonstrated by the failure of Buddhism's core ideals to really penetrate the national character.
Absolutely. Take pessimism. Buddhism brought this deeply pessimistic philosophy about the suffering inherent in life. It taught it for nearly 14 centuries.
And yet the Japanese people remained and remain remarkably sunny-hearted and optimistic.
The resilience of the native temperament is profound. Or take heaven and hell. These ideas were displayed and taught for centuries as a way to enforce moral behavior.
But historical records say that few Japanese reference these ideas without a smile.
A cultural detachment from that kind of fear-based theology. And finally, there's pacifism. Buddhism preaches gentleness and peace.
But Japan remained, at its core, a nation of formidable warriors, untouched by effeminacy, retaining the fierceness of the old feudal days.
The Buddhist ideal of universal pacifism just failed entirely to supplant the warrior ethic.
So the conclusion is that the essence of Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan, remains the same.
The same chivalrous, indomitable, patriotic soul that Shinto created and nourished. The only true, unshakable faith is loyalty to the land and the emperor. The highest duty is dying for the emperor and the state.
Which brings us to the next major force, the Jesuit missions of the 16th century.
Starting with Francis Xavier in 1549. And they were initially welcomed with that characteristic Japanese curiosity and hospitality.
And they had extraordinary initial success in getting converts.
They did, especially among the ruling class. And this success came down to two main causes, both of which, interestingly, mirrored the methods of their Buddhist predecessors.
The first was an assimilation strategy.
Right. Instead of attacking the existing religions, the Jesuits strategically presented Christianity as just another familiar form of belief. They used Buddhist rituals, terminology, even imagery to make it more palatable.
There's the example of the goddess of mercy, Kwannon.
A perfect, deliberate example. The Jesuit leaders quickly saw that this beloved figure would only need a name change to serve effectively as the Virgin Mary. It was a strategic way to get an indigenous foothold.
And the second, and far more effective, cause.
A direct appeal to the passion of loyalty. This is the foundational element of the national faith. Again, imitating the Buddhists, the Jesuits focused their efforts not on the common people, but on converting the powerful daimyo, the feudal rulers.
Because if you get the ruler, you get their subjects.
Instantly and devotedly. This highlights a crucial factor in Japan, the culture of top-down authority. A scholar, Mr. Kaneko, is cited as saying no religion ever gained real influence in the empire unless it first won over the highest political authority.
So those 20 centuries of training in loyalty to authority is a critical active factor.
It's everything. The 16th century Jesuit used this powerful aid to his full advantage. Conversions were often mass events, driven by a ruler's political decision.
And the research contrasts this with the later Protestant missionary movement.
Sharply. The Protestant effort is noted for having overlooked this primal, hierarchical element, content to, quote, the common people heard him gladly, an approach that was just completely counterproductive in the Japanese context.
Which brings up a paradox. Given this top-down conversion, how do we explain the constancy of the hundreds of thousands of Catholic converts who later faced persecution and death?
It does seem paradoxical.
Yeah.
They endured hideous tortures when Christianity was systematically eliminated in the early 17th century.
So how much did they really understand about the faith they were dying for?
The research suggests very little. The vast majority likely knew very little about the theological underpinnings. You have to remember the severe language barrier, the rushed nature of the mass conversions.
It would have been impossible to get enough doctrinal knowledge to inspire that kind of martyrdom on its own.
And we have direct testimony. Kempfer's account from 1690 noted 50 imprisoned peasants who were identified as Christians but knew little more than the names of the Savior and the Virgin Mary.
And this was likely common.
The accounts suggest it was. So the only rational, historically consistent explanation for their marvelous constancy
is their fundamental sentiment of loyalty.
But loyalty unto the princes and lords who had first adopted the faith. Their sacrifice was driven less by theological conviction and more by the deep-seated national principle of following their rulers. They were being loyal to their Lord's way, even to the death. Now let's turn to the modern era, the renewed Roman Catholic missions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
They were highly active, but they were operating in the face of, well, almost insurmountable obstacles from that historical trauma.
What were the main challenges?
First, the disastrous ruin of the previous enterprise. Second, the widespread popular hatred of the Catholic name for the 300 years in between. And third, a sustained active suspicion that religious ascendancy might lead to political subjugation. Years ago is described as being still alive and active.
So acknowledging fealty to a Western pope is still seen as a breach of loyalty to the emperor by many leaders and parts of the population. Yes, it directly links religious affiliation with potential political disloyalty, which makes conversion a profoundly unpatriotic act for traditionalists.
And what do the numbers say about the modern effort?
Well, despite those handicaps, the statistics are interesting. In 1894, the Roman Catholic forces, though much smaller than the Protestant army of invasion, claimed about 50,000 converts.
Which matched the Protestant total at the time.
It did. But this gives us a baseline. After 30 years of concerted effort, you have 100,000 converts total, against a population of almost 40 million.
If you project that rate forward,
the accounts conclude that the date for any national conversion must be set at a very distant date.
And this limited progress is especially striking when you consider the context of the period. Japan was desperate to adopt Western
Was
institutions.
desperate. They were sending commissions everywhere to investigate and adopt Western military systems, judicial codes, educational models, industry.
It was a critical window of openness.
The critical time when Christianity might have gained ascendancy if it had proven itself superior.
And in fact, there was a government commission sent to investigate that very thing.
There was. An official commission sent abroad to investigate the expediency of adopting Christianity as the state religion, specifically to improve the moral condition of the people.
Which shows a real pragmatic willingness to consider it.
A willingness to see it as a potential tool for modernization.
But the Commission's findings reported against adopting the Western religion.
They did. And the research highlights this, noting that it confirmed the verdict of the 17th century observer, Kempfer, who had concluded that the Japanese often outdo Christians in purity of life.
What was the rationale for the rejection?
It was specific and, from a missionary viewpoint, highly critical. The commission concluded that, judging from the observable moral conditions and social problems in the West, Christianity was not a more potent influence for righteous living than Japan's own native religions and philosophies.
So they decided their existing moral framework was sufficient.
Sufficient, if not superior, for maintaining national morality and achieving national goodness. So Christianity was rejected as a state-building tool.
Which is a remarkable fact. In this massive revolution, where Japan adopted everything from parliaments to railroads, Christianity was one of the few Western things deliberately excluded.
Deliberately excluded as being prejudicial to the nation's interests of morality.
And that political decision was decisive.
Absolutely. If the authorities had concluded otherwise, that powerful instinct of loyalty among the masses would have become the missionaries' greatest ally instead of their greatest obstacle. The Christianization of the land could have been rapid.
If we look at this on a global scale, the research cites historical precedents that make the odds for this kind of conversion seem hopeless.
It does, again, from that 19th century deterministic perspective. It points out that successful religious propagandism has historically been confined within strict racial and cultural limits.
So Christianity within the so-called Aryan family, Buddhism among Turanian races, and so on.
Yes, and according to that historical precedent, there are no successful, lasting examples on which to build the hope of a genuine conversion of a Turanian race like the Japanese to Christianity.
And there's another point. Christendom has never successfully forced its dogmas on a people able to maintain their national existence and sovereignty.
Right. The nominal successes were typically with small, weakened, or vanishing populations.
Not a rising world power.
Exactly. As Japan takes its place among the modern world powers, its patriotic pulse beats too strongly for that kind of fundamental cultural conversion. National glory and national loyalty act as a permanent psychological barrier.
And in fact, that national spirit is now demanding control even within the small Christian community that does exist.
It is creating a huge administrative and doctrinal crisis for foreign mission boards.
What does that crisis look like?
It's an insistent demand from the native converts that the management, control, and property of the missions be placed entirely in their own hands. They want to dispense with foreign workers.
And this mirrors what happened in other sectors with foreign teachers and engineers.
Precisely. They were thanked and dismissed once native Japanese personnel were trained to take their place.
And it's not just about administration, is it? It's about doctrine, too.
That's the crucial part. There is a manifest, unyielding determination that any future doctrinal developments must align explicitly with the Japanese spirit, traditions, customs, and the essential faiths of the nation's life.
So the core cultural defense mechanism is still fully operational.
And adaptive. So the prediction from the research is clear. Any lasting Christian faith in Japan will inevitably be an essentially Japanese Christianity, one profoundly assimilated with the old loyalties.
Foreign propagandists will find their occupation gone.
As native influences take the reins, it suggests that even this ideological invasion, the one that seemed to have a hope of success, will ultimately fail to fundamentally alter the national soul.
Now, the Japanese people are grateful for the educational and philanthropic work of missionaries.
Profoundly grateful for things like modern medicine and education. But they're not blind to the ulterior purpose of sectarian aggrandizement that often comes with it.
So they accept the philanthropy but resist the conversion.
Which raises a final, important question about the moral cost of this alien zeal. Is the obligation for the good work canceled out by the active breaking down of old moral sanctions? This inconsiderate zeal to destroy what they're pleased to call idolatry.
And this conflict centers on one practice in particular, ancestral worship.
Yes, the denunciation of this practice by missionaries is seen as highly destructive to the social order. It's a lovely, binding feature of domestic life. It ensures generational continuity and respect, and historically, it's been the direct source of the nation's virile qualities, its strength and resilience.
The research frames it as being no more deserving of the stigma of idolatry than the Western custom of laying flowers on a grave.
It's a powerful analogy. This ancestral practice provided the functional moral code the pure Shinto was often said to lack. Trying to destroy it is seen as being culturally comparable to a powerful alien organization trying to destroy the Decalogue in the West.
An act of profound cultural vandalism.
It is.
Japan will remain, in its foundational faith, as in its polity and sovereignty, the unconquered island realm.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.